Intonation in American English. Mastering syllable stress in words. Intonation can be thought of as the music of speech. Speaking with a range of pitches makes the most important words or ideas in your speech reach the listener effectively. At the same time that we use pitch to stress key syllables, it's very important to properly reduce unstressed syllables. That may seem simple, but overpronunciation of unstressed syllables is a common issue for many second language speakers of English. In this course, we will get right inside of the syllables and explore them in detail so that you understand the differences. More importantly, we'll do extensive drills of sounds and words to ensure that this understanding gets into your body and your speaking. After exploring different pitch tones that are used in single-syllable words, we'll get into the fundamental patterns of the course, the two different intonation patterns for two-syllable words. We'll go further with our explanations and drills, taking on multisyllabic words as well. If you feel you have good pronunciation in English, but that there's something that's keeping your speech from flowing, this may be exactly the course you need. You may already have the ability to be understood easily when you speak slowly and clearly. This is a very high level of skill, and you should congratulate yourself on your accomplishments. If you do have concerns about your speech, can you pinpoint what they are? Do you feel like you're overpronouncing some syllables? Do you feel your speech sounds too rushed or that it sounds too slow? Do you ever feel like you don't have enough breath or that it takes too much energy to speak English? Going deeper into a study of intonation will help you achieve speech that is natural and powerful, and as fun for your listening audience of one or many people to listen to as it is for you to speak. This is an advanced and specific course. It is not intended for beginning speakers of English. It is also not a pronunciation course specifically, even though intonation is indeed an integral part of pronunciation. If you are interested in studying both pronunciation of the phonemes of English and intonation, the best approach would ordinarily be to start with pronunciation. A mastery of pronunciation will allow you to be understood when you speak slowly. A mastery of intonation will improve your pronunciation, overall speech, speed, efficiency, flow, articulation, and expressiveness. The starting point for a study of intonation is in the pitch tones, the single syllables, and the two fundamental two-syllable intonation patterns. We cover those elements in this course. In the course, we will often start drills with nonsense sounds instead of words to free ourselves of any preconceived ideas of how vowels, consonants, or words should sound. Many learners have words in their spoken vocabulary that have been reinforced with improper intonation. The best way to break these patterns is by starting with nonsense sounds and then moving into words as if learning them for the first time. Try to go with the flow of the course and not think too far ahead. It's the best way to change set patterns. Have fun and enjoy the process. We're taking a creative approach to a very specific goal. Approach the work with a sense of play and trust that the design of the course is specific and targeted to our goals. Thank you for taking this course. Let's get started. Take a quick moment now. You can set a timer for 5 minutes if you like. I want you to write down your goals for this course. I recently heard this saying, a goal is not a goal unless you write it down. Writing down your goals now will really help keep you focused on exactly what you want out of this course. If you take a moment to do this, you're very likely to get the most out of this course. Take a look at the PDF, or you can just stay with me here and I'll go through the questions with you. Number 1, what do you think are your current strengths and weaknesses in your English communication? You can pause the recording and take a moment to write down a few thoughts in answer to this question. Number 2, what do you think is the single most important thing in your speech that, if corrected or improved, would significantly change the power of your English communication? Again, pause the recording and take a moment to write down a few thoughts in answer to that question. And finally, number 3, how do you think improving your English communication, specifically your intonation, will affect your personal and professional life? Be specific, use your imagination, and have fun with it. If you're not sure exactly how better intonation will improve your speech, how do you think improving your speech in general will benefit you in these areas? Once again, pause the recording and take a moment to give some thought to this important question about your goals. Okay? Great. Thank you for taking a moment to write down your goals. Keep them handy and refer back to them as we move forward in the course. Now, let's get started. I'll see you in the next lecture. Watch the next video, which covers a few important concepts that will be fundamental in moving forward in the course. Pay particular attention to these 2 concepts. Number 1, getting it in your body. And number 2, muscle memory. After this video, there will be a short 3-question quiz. Don't worry about the quiz. You'll have the answers from watching the next video. The quiz is just to make sure we're clear of these concepts before we move on in the course. We'll also talk a bit in the next video about a technical detail, specifically how sounds are written out in the course. See you soon. There are 2 concepts that are important to understand in order to get the most out of this course. The first is the idea of getting the information not just into your mind, but more importantly, into your body. We're taking the same approach as actors, musicians, dancers, and other creative artists. We want this information in our body. Of course, we need to understand it intellectually as well, but our main focus is on drilling, speaking, and using our voices and our bodies to learn. A useful place where the mind can come into play is in testing yourself, and it's great to do that occasionally. Record one of the drills as it plays out, and you listen and repeat. Afterwards, listen back and analyze your speech and compare it to the guide track. Make note of any modifications that you want to make. This is a great tool for accelerating your progress. When you're doing the drills themselves, the most important thing to remember is that you must be speaking out loud. In a sense, your body is the musical instrument. Your greatest learning will come not from the intellectual understanding, but by doing, and doing, and doing. The next important concept is muscle memory. Musicians and others utilize this principle in advancing their craft. The way to learn to do a specific motor task quickly is to first do it very slowly, and then repeat that action. Repeating that action could be called practicing, but remember, practicing very slowly, at least at first. Your body soon learns how to perform that action, at which point it becomes easy to increase the speed. Many of the exercises will involve saying words, even syllables or parts of syllables, specifically the vowels, and saying them very slowly. Please make sure not to skip over these parts and resist the temptation to just listen and say to yourself, okay, I understand, I can do this. Do the drilling. Say the sounds out loud, even if they seem too simple and you feel it's unnecessary. I promise you, you won't be sorry you did. Those are our 2 important concepts, getting it in the body and muscle memory. We are treating our bodies like musical instruments, and we are going to learn and train primarily by doing. One final technical detail to discuss is how we will reference or write down sounds in this course. As you know, this is an intonation course, but we will reference pronunciation, and we want to be accurate. The most precise way to indicate how something is pronounced is by using the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA. I recommend learning the IPA if you don't already know it, but it's not required for this course. If I use any IPA symbols in this course, I'll also provide another way of clarifying the pronunciation. The second way to indicate pronunciation is by writing out sounds phonetically, using letters of the alphabet. This is the approach we'll take to keep things simple for everyone and to keep our focus on intonation. It's best to be consistent when using letters to write out sounds. Ordinarily, I prefer to write out the sounds ah and e with two letters, ah for ah and ee for e. However, in our diagrams, it's easier to visualize the diagrams by using a single letter. So you'll also see a single letter A for the sound ah and a single letter E used for the sound E. This will be clear when we get to those sections and you hear me speaking. In some cases, words won't be written out phonetically. We'll just spell them out with the actual letters of the word. We'll learn a lot in this course about how words often sound very different than they appear. In the next two sections, we're going to explore some elements of language and speech. The actual drilling section won't begin until afterwards. However, you should feel free to start speaking out loud right away and repeating any tones, sounds, or words that you hear me say. I'll be talking about vowels and consonants, as well as exploring pitch and different tones. In this section, we're going to look at and answer a couple of questions. Take a look at this question for a moment and think about it. That's the first topic that we'll explore, the answer to the question, what are vowels and consonants? And let me put another question up, which I'd like you to just take a moment to think about. It's okay if you don't know the exact answer, but take a look at this. Okay? What is pitch? These are important questions in order for us to learn about intonation, and we're going to explore and answer these questions one at a time. We're going to start with the first question, what are vowels and consonants? But first, some clarification. The word vowel and the word consonant, these words could be used to refer to the written language, the 26 letters of the written alphabet. The written language has 5 vowels and 21 consonants. But in this course, we're concerned about the spoken language, and therefore I'll use the words vowel and consonant primarily to refer to the spoken vowel sounds and consonant sounds. So let's start by making any sound, but not singing, just speaking, and letting an open, easy sound flow out of your mouth. I'm going to start with this sound. Ah, which I could write like this. Ah. Now let's do this again. Notice that I'm not slowing down the sound in any way with my mouth, with my tongue, with my lips, any part of my mouth. I'm just letting the sound flow easily. Now I'm going to change the shape of my mouth a little bit and let the air flow out on my voice as I use my voice to make the sound E, which I could write like this. Again, E. And don't worry about whether your sound is exactly the same as my sound or not. And let me do this one more time. This time I'm going to round my lips and I'll make the sound O. Now, these were all very easy, free-flowing sounds to make. Let's take a look at some ways of describing these sounds. A free-flowing sound, E. What I mean by that is the mouth is not slowing down or in any way inhibiting the sound, or inhibiting the flow of air. What else? An open sound. Okay. That's true. That would be another way of describing this sound, at least open in the sense that we're not restricting the flow of air. What else can we say about these sounds that we just made? The voice box creates the sound. Right, that is true of all of these sounds. When the mouth is open in this way and the air is free flowing, if you didn't use your voice box, you would just get something like a sigh, the sound of air, the sound of a breath. The sounds we made all used the voice box. Now you can touch your voice box when you make these sounds and you'll feel it vibrating. E. Try that. Ah. Oh. And finally, airflow is not obstructed. Yes, that's true. It's not restricted in any way. It flows freely. These are all good ways of describing these sounds. Now, you may wonder how exactly we would obstruct the airflow. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The sounds that can be described in this way are vowels. Now, there's a range of vowel sounds, so we could say relatively open instead of just saying an open sound, but compared to consonants, vowel sounds are quite open. The main thing to remember is that they are always voiced and that the airflow is not obstructed. And, as we said before, all English words contain at least one vowel. Ooh. I. Ah. These are all vowel sounds. But let me put up another question for a moment. Take a moment to read this question and think about it. What is a consonant? This is a good example of a consonant, the sound D. Here's another consonant, G. B. V. Z. J. Sh. F. These fricative sounds, the microphone sometimes does not pick them up, especially these sounds sh and f. I'll explain why in a moment. So, what is a consonant? Anything that you noticed about all of these sounds that they had in common? What about in comparison to vowels? Well, the first thing you may have noticed is that unlike vowels, with consonants, the airflow is obstructed or restricted in some way. In the case of the sound f, it is my upper teeth and lower lip that are restricting the flow of air. Different parts of the mouth, called the articulators, slow down the airflow and create the consonant sounds. Now here's an interesting distinction between vowels and consonants. All vowels are voiced, but consonants may be voiced or unvoiced. In fact, this sound that I'm making now is an unvoiced sound, which is why I had to move closer to the microphone. It's possible the microphone won't even pick it up. It may not recognize this as a sound. It may think it's background noise and squeeze it out, in which case I'll have to add it back in. But I'm going to make the sound again. If you touch your voice box, you'll notice that it's not vibrating when you make this sound. Unvoiced sounds are also called whispered sounds. Notice that if I add my voice to an unvoiced sound, I get a different sound. In this case, the sound V. V is a voiced sound. Now, we talked earlier about the fact that all English words contain at least one vowel sound. A word doesn't have to have a consonant sound. Certainly, most words will have at least one consonant. So far, we've broken down our sounds of English into two groups, the vowels and the consonants, and we've further broken down consonants into voiced and unvoiced sounds. It's worth going a little bit further into detail with this and learning what the unvoiced sounds are. This is extremely valuable for both pronunciation and intonation. If you already know this, stay with me for a moment. If this is new to you, I think you'll find it particularly interesting. And as soon as we get to the next section, you'll see how powerful this knowledge is. We're going to look now at pairs of unvoiced and voiced sounds. Cognates. Cognates are pairs of sounds that are made the exact same way with the mouth. Essentially, they are the same sound, but one of them is whispered and the other is voiced. Now, we won't spend a lot of time here getting overly detailed in how to pronounce each of these sounds, since this is not a pronunciation course. But notice the similarity in quality between the unvoiced and the voiced sounds in each cognate pair. My lips together, I blow a little bit of air out, and I create the sound P. If I add my voice and think of the vibrations directly on the lips and create otherwise the same sound, but with my voice, I get the sound B. The tip of the tongue going to the gum ridge, air releasing, T. The exact same sound using my voice, D. The back of the tongue going up to the palate, air releases, a plosive sound like the other four so far, the sound K. If I add my voice to the exact same sound, I get the sixth and final plosive sound, G. As we discussed, the lower lip going to the cutting edge of the upper teeth for the sound F. The unvoiced sound, adding my voice, V. For this sound, usually made with the letter S, the tip of the tongue is behind the lower front teeth, or the tip of the tongue can be up near the gum ridge. And you'll use either the tip of the tongue, or if it's lower down, the area just back from the tip, close to but not touching the gum ridge as you send air out through the center, the sound S. If you add your voice to the exact same mouth movement, you get the voiced sound Z. The tip of the tongue going to the cutting edge of the upper teeth. This is another fricative sound. Air passing through is part of the sound. This is the unvoiced sound F, usually made with the letters TH. If I add my voice to the exact same sound, I get the sound the. Another fricative sound. Instead of the thin sound made with the letter S, the lips are more rounded and more air comes over the blade of the tongue to create this sound sh. The tip of the tongue can be in the same position as for the S, either up behind the gum ridge or behind the lower front teeth. If I add my voice to that sound, everything else exactly the same, I get the sound zh. And finally, a blend of the second sound in our list, t, and the last sound in our list, sh. These sounds blend together to create the sound ch, usually written with the letters ch. If I add my voice to that exact same sound, I get the voiced sound j. Other than these 8 sounds in the left column, all other consonant sounds are voiced. The sound made by the letter H is lightly voiced. So these are the 8 unvoiced sounds to remember. You don't need to memorize them, but Here's an expression you can use if you want. As I said, you don't need to memorize this. We'll also revisit this idea in the course, which will help you learn more about this. But if you say these sounds and touch your voice box, you shouldn't feel any vibration there. I'll say these sounds in the order they're written in this sentence. Kate thinks fried potato chips should taste sweet. Let's move on and talk about one more important concept in this section. Pitch. What is pitch? A simple definition of pitch is how high or low a note is. We can also think of the movement of pitch, such as moving from a lower note to a higher note, or from a higher note to a lower note. Now, let's use one of our vowels to explore pitch. Let's use the vowel ah. These are the low notes, if you can see with my cursor down here, and these are the high notes up here. Now, we're not really going to use this large of a range, but let's use this keyboard image so that we're thinking of moving our pitch around. We're going to go from low to high. So let's move our keyboard so it moves from low to high. Listen and repeat the sound of a note going up in pitch, going from a lower note to a higher note. Ah, ah, ah. If this is challenging, you could also try just using the words low and high, or you could gesture using your hand, starting low down and going high. You could go to a keyboard and play a note and repeat the note to get that in your body, a low note and a high note. Let's continue with the sound ah from low to high. Ah. You could also try it with the word up. Try this with the word up. Up. Now that will probably help quite a bit in getting this understanding into your body. But you can also use body movements or gestures. You can move your hand, as I said, from low to high. You could even stand up for high notes and sit down for low notes if you feel that you need something more, if this feels unfamiliar to you and you need some more illustration or gesture to get this into your body. Let's try it again just with the sound ah. Ah, ah. Now let's get another piano keyboard here and turn it the other way to represent coming down in pitch. Now, coming down in pitch is usually easier for people. If it's challenging, you can just reverse the things that we talked about with the hand gesture or your whole body standing up and sitting down, or thinking of the words high and low with matching sounds. I'm going to use the word down and come down in pitch from a higher sound to a lower sound. Down. And repeating. Down. Okay? Now that we've slowed down our examination of pitch and even used words like high and low to make it very clear in our body what we want to happen with the sound, let's go back to just using the sound ah. Repeat as I go up and then down in pitch. Okay, I'm going to first go up and then I'm going to come down. I'll break it into two pieces initially. Listen and repeat. Ah, ah. ah, 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 ah. Now, putting these sounds together, let's move the vowel sound up and then down, this time without stopping. Ah, ah, ah. Now, let's just relax this sound a little bit. This is absolutely muscle memory and getting it into the body at work. We're doing something extremely slowly that ultimately will be doing at regular speed much more quickly than this, but we're really slowing it down to examine it if this is not something that is part of your natural speech. As a native speaker, I never learned this. Native speakers don't learn this concept. If you study acting, then you'll get into some study of stressing words, but not in such a minuscule way by looking at the vowel peak. As small children, as infants, we were hearing these sounds and we adopted this into our bodies. So we're doing something different, which is we're actually studying the method, practicing it slowly in order to get it into our body. So let's just relax the sound a little bit now. We've been stretching it out. Now we're going to make it a little shorter, a little more relaxed, a little more natural sounding. Instead of thinking of this peak that's created by a pitch moving up and then down, imagine that we're just making the sound, but it's important that the listener in front of us knows that we're making this sound. So we're going to use stress. We're going to think of using stress. Okay, you can imagine someone in front of you and go ahead and say these sounds. Listen and repeat as I do, as if I'm saying this important sound to them. Ah, ah, ah. Good. Again, this is muscle memory at work. Now, we're not going to take any sounds any more slowly than this. We're already picking up speed, as you noticed. But now you should feel like this vowel peak is in your speech. The value of having the vowel peak in your speech and having it readily available is that you'll be more likely to use pitch to stress a word instead of using volume. Pitch is a subtler and more expressive way of emphasizing important words, important ideas, as opposed to just using volume. If you feel like you might need to spend a little more time to get this vowel peak comfortably into your speech, you can always come back and review this section anytime in the future. Let's move on to the vowel E. E. And now oo, ooh. And now with the vowel O, oh. Okay, let's use this symbol to represent the vowel peak in the shape of our piano keyboards going up and down. And we'll put this box here to represent a syllable. Okay, here's our syllable written to indicate a vowel peak. Listen and repeat. Da, ma, me, fo. Okay, very good work on practicing the vowel peak. The purpose of slowly practicing the vowel peak is to add more range into your speaking and to allow your pitch to travel without your having to consciously think about it. Having a wide range of notes in your voice can help to make your communication clear and precise. Let's move to the next section where we'll look at pitch tones within syllables. Let's review the vowel peak. We put a lot of focus on the vowel peak in this course because it's important to be able to easily lengthen vowels in order to stress certain words and ideas when we're speaking. Instead of just thinking of making a stressed syllable of a vowel longer, it's useful to think of that vowel as going up and down. Our ultimate goal is that the movement of pitch happens automatically in response to our thought or emotion, as opposed to our technical thought to manipulate the pitch. Let's listen and repeat this sound a few times, taking it slowly at first, and then picking up speed. Da, da, da. We've practiced this sound with many nonsense syllables. In some cases, when we're practicing a nonsense syllable, a combination of a consonant and a vowel, it's actually also a recognizable word. Here's the word see spoken with a vowel peak. See. The vowel peak draws our attention to the word. Whether there is a vowel peak or not, the usual way of saying a word that ends with a vowel, see, 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 is to lengthen the vowel and to drop the pitch. Now, we'll call this tone the long drop, and we'll use this image to represent it. See, see, see. When we're practicing saying words slowly and clearly, especially in word lists, it's often easiest to include a vowel peak. You'll notice, for example, when people are reading word lists, such as Word Lists to Practice English, that when they speak slowly and methodically, there is usually extra stress on each word. You may find this happening without even thinking about it. So don't worry if you're going up a little bit in pitch at the beginning and making a little bit of a vowel peak. But this is not our focus here. The main thing we're focusing on now is the drop in pitch. Keep the vowel long and drop the pitch for these words and any words that end with a vowel sound. When you see this symbol, it should be pretty obvious visually. This is the long drop tone. As we mentioned, words that end with vowels will be spoken with the long drop tone. See, may, go. Now remember, we talked about consonants, and we talked about consonants being broken up into two groups, unvoiced and voiced consonants. Well, we're going to see this long drop tone with words or syllables that end with consonants from one of those groups. Can you guess which group? You're not expected to know this, but it's quite interesting. Here comes the answer. Yes. Words or syllables that end with a voiced consonant will also use the long drop tone. Now let's keep these things simple and look at a few words that just start with a vowel sound and end with a voiced consonant. Listen and repeat these words spoken with a long drop tone. Aid, abe, ode, We will very often hear this long drop tone. You'll hear it in syllables that end with vowels, and we will hear it in syllables that end with voiced consonants. Let's look at another pitch tone. This is the short flat tone, and as the name suggests, the vowel length will be shorter and it will not have the kind of drop in pitch that we hear with the long drop tone. This is the tone that we'll hear in vowels before unvoiced consonants. The unvoiced consonants are also called whispered consonants. Now, in a moment, we'll review the voiced and unvoiced consonants, and we'll also look at pairs of sounds to compare the long drop and the short flat tones. But for starters, let's look at the short flat tone in various vowels before unvoiced consonants. The sound T, which is made with the letter T, and the sound P, which is made with the letter P. Let's make the vowel sound A, but we won't make it for as long as we've been doing. The sound is going to be cut off with the sound T. Listen and repeat. 8. Let's go through a few more vowel sounds using the short flat tone with each of them before the consonant sound T cuts off the vowel. Eat. Oat. Out. Oot. Now let's go back to the vowel sound A, and this time, after the short flat tone, we'll cut the sound off with the consonant sound P with the letter P. Listen and repeat. Ape. Eep. Ope. Alp. Oop. As we've done before, and will do more of, we're intentionally just using nonsense sounds in order to focus on the pitch tones, using vowels followed by consonants. Now, let's drill some words. These aren't nonsense sounds, but actual words. All of these words end with unvoiced consonants. Therefore, they will all use the short flat tone. Listen and repeat. Loop. Hope. Eat. Meet. Late. We talked in the last section about cognates, pairs of consonant sounds, one of which is unvoiced and the other is voiced. For example, the unvoiced sound T and the voiced sound D. In fact, we looked briefly at all of the cognates. And in this section, we looked at the two pitch tones. We just finished looking at the short flat tone, which is used in syllables that end with unvoiced consonants. And before that, we looked at the long drop tone, which is used in syllables that end with a vowel or a voiced consonant. We're just going to go a little further with this now and compare the long drop and the short flat by saying pairs of words one at a time, one with the short flat tone and one with the long drop tone. And a great way to do that is by using words with endings that are cognates. Now what you'll start to notice is that it's actually the pitch change, the different tones that let the listener know which word we mean. As we go through the list, we'll tend to give full pronunciation to all of the word, including the ending. In speech, in everyday conversation, endings of words are often not given as much time or careful pronunciation. So getting comfortable with these pitch tones will really help in making sure you're always understood precisely. Listen and repeat the following pairs of words. Pay attention to the difference between the short flat tone and the long drop tone, both as you listen to me saying the words one after the other and as you repeat them. Beat. Bead. seat, seed, leaf, leave, rope, robe, root, rude, ice, eyes, bet, bed. From here on out, we're going to be sharing time in terms of speaking. I'll give some explanations along the way, of course, but most of the material from here on out will consist of my saying lists of words in the different patterns and you're repeating them. Congratulations on getting through the main lecture content of the course. I hope you enjoy the drills that follow. We will now drill one-syllable words ending with vowels, voiced endings, and unvoiced endings. These three groups will all be drilled using the appropriate pitch tones. As you know, words ending with vowels or voiced consonants will use the long drop tone. Words ending with unvoiced consonants will use the short flat tone. As we mentioned earlier, in word lists, it's sometimes natural to put extra emphasis on each word and add a vowel peak. You may hear this in the recording, and you may find you're doing it yourself. Keep in mind that a vowel peak can be added to words that use a short flat or a long drop tone. You may notice that as soon as you start to say the vowel, it will rise up. For a short flat tone, the pitch drops again to end the peak, and then the vowel ends. For a long drop tone, the pitch is longer and drops further before it ends. You've already drilled the short flat and long drop tones together to get a sense of how they compare. In this section, we'll work each of these tones separately. Here we go with pattern 1A, the long drop. B, buy, chew, do, draw, dry, fly, go, I, owe, pay, ray, see, stay, to. This is pattern 1A with the long drop with voiced endings. Add, age, bin, build, burn, call, can, carve, change, charge, choose, crawl, curve, done, drain, drawn, fall, flown, fund, gold, grin, had, harm, join, lend, own, peer, plan, praise, raise, read, ride, rise, round, rude, rule, run, seed, seen, sell, send, serve, share, sum, spread, spun, stall, swear, trade, trail, use, warm, one, warn, wound. Okay, this is pattern 1B, the short flat tone with unvoiced endings. Here we go. Bent, brush, burst, check, count, cross, drift, drink, fix, greet, grip, it, laugh, march, pack, park, race, rate, reach, rip, rope, rush, seat, split, start, stretch, trace, trap, use, right. In this section, we'll focus on understanding and drilling two-syllable words. For now, we're going to move away from thinking about the vowel peak and the long drop and short flat tones. Our main focus now is in getting comfortable with the difference between stressed and unstressed syllables. We will look at and drill the two fundamental two-syllable patterns, as well as one less common one. If you feel you need more practice on one-syllable words, consider that it's okay to move on to two and more syllable words now. You don't have to feel like you've mastered the pitch tones and everything that came before. You can revisit one-syllable words in the future if you feel you need more time to review them. As we move on, we won't be grouping words according to whether their endings are voiced or unvoiced. We will sometimes use the vowel peak symbol to remind you to focus on and lengthen the stressed syllable of words. Let's start with one-syllable words, or we'll even just start with sounds. As we've been doing, this can represent a syllable, da. Let's put a vowel peak into this syllable so that we make it nice and long. Right now, as we start, it's better to overdo it than to underdo it. Da. Now these are just nonsense sounds that we're making. Da. Ma. Da. Ma. Me. Fo. Here's our single stressed syllable. Now let's add another syllable before the stressed syllable, and we're going to make this one quite a bit smaller. And let's get rid of the vowel peak for now, just for a second, to make this visual clearer. We're not saying we can't use a vowel peak in that syllable. We're just not including the symbol for now. And let's hear what this pattern would sound like. And to do that, let's use these nonsense sounds. Da-da. 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 This is a common two-syllable intonation pattern. We'll call this pattern 2A, and it's the one that we're going to discuss now and drill in this next lecture. A quick description of this pattern is a two-syllable word with stress on the second syllable. But let's talk a bit about the first syllable, the one that right now we're just using the short sound d to represent. How would we describe this syllable? Let's talk about this syllable in relation to the stressed syllable. Well, the first thing we notice is it's lower in pitch. D, d. Da-da, da-da, da-da. What else can we say about it? D, d, d. Anything that you notice? Compared to the stressed syllable, is there anything that you notice about it? Da-da. It's shorter in length. And if you say this pattern to yourself, or if you listen to it while I'm saying it, that's probably pretty obvious. Da-da. Da-da. We can really hear that this first syllable is shorter and lower in pitch. Now here's something that's less obvious, but extremely valuable to be aware of. And I'm going to put this up on the screen for you to read. And please read that to yourself. The unstressed syllable d requires much less breath than the stressed syllable da. Da-da. Now you might already be doing this using minimal breath, but it's also possible, especially if you've gotten into a pattern of overpronouncing unstressed syllables, that you are using more breath than you need for this unstressed syllable. This is also why we're spending time on unstressed syllables. When we say this pattern, da-da, it's easy to make an effort to use minimal breath on the first syllable. When we move into words that have this pattern, you might find yourself wanting to use much more breath on this first syllable. So when we get there, remind yourself on how little breath we're using here. And try to use that same ratio when we're saying actual words. Da-da. Here's one other idea, and this works along with the idea of using less breath. And I'm going to put this up on the screen for you to look at. Now, please read that to yourself. Now, this may seem really abstract, but it's important and it will make sense. Step by step, we'll incorporate this into our drilling. Less mental energy. Now, how on earth do we use less mental energy on one syllable than we do on another? If I say the unstressed syllable d right now, obviously I'm thinking d, d. And if I say the stressed syllable da, then obviously I'm thinking da. And I would agree with that. If I'm saying these syllables one at a time, I would say they require the same amount of mental energy. But we're not saying these syllables one at a time when we're saying them in words. And understanding that is going to help us quite a bit. Let's look at a typical word that uses this pattern, and we'll continue to use these nonsense syllables. But think of this as representing a word. I put a vowel peak here, so we can really make sure that we're focusing on the stressed syllable. Even if we give it a little extra stress right now, that's fine. And I'm going to remove these words describing the unstressed syllable. So here's our word. Da. Now we want to focus on the second syllable, da. By focusing on the second syllable, in other words, by putting your mental energy there, you will find that very little breath is required to say the first syllable. Now, this may seem very simple and obvious to you, or this may seem very abstract and impossible. But stay with me. We're going to break this down and take it slowly. So here's our word. Focus here on the stressed syllable. You can look at it this way. You're already thinking da. You're focused on the sound da. And you're just going to let the sound d just fall out of your mouth while you're on your way to say da. Let's try that. Da-da. Da-da. Now, you could really pause right now and spend a lot of time thinking about and practicing this concept. Again, on the one hand, this may seem extremely complex, or it may sound extremely simple and easy to do. It's easy to do with nonsense syllables like this. If you've been speaking English as a second language and have gotten in the habit of overpronouncing unstressed syllables, just be aware of the fact that undoing that and changing those patterns in your speech takes some time and regular attention, but it can be done. And starting with two-syllable words and really seeing how to handle these unstressed syllables is the best way that I know to do it. Be patient and work through these drills systematically and know that we're working towards saying longer words. I first learned about the concept of breath support decades ago. Breath is directly related to thought. Actors need to have a deep understanding of this for many reasons. In real life, when we have a big thought, we take a big breath. Our body takes a big breath without us thinking about it. If we then have a lot of words to say, our body supports our breath with a slight amount of tension in our center, allowing us to say many words on a small amount of breath. Observe this sometime in your first language in a real-life situation. Notice what your center is doing. Put a hand on your belly and feel the tension, that bit of tension that supports your breath as you speak. You can even use your imagination and pretend you have something important to say to someone. You'll notice that as soon as you have that thought, especially if there's a lot of feeling or emotion behind what you're saying, breath drops into your body and there is support in your center so that you can speak. Actors who understand this and have worked to be able to recreate this can say scripted words and create the illusion that the words are really their own. They're not simply thinking of words that are in their head and reciting the words as they think of them. One other thing you might notice about the unstressed sound d is that very little mouth movement is required. I can make the sound without moving my jaw. Now, it might be a bit difficult to think about how much of your jaw is moving, but if you look at a reflection of yourself, you can use the distance between your teeth as an indication of how much of your jaw is moving. Now, when I say a stressed syllable like da, da, it's clear that my mouth is opening and my jaw is moving. But when I say an unstressed syllable like d, d, you'll notice that there's very little movement. Okay, let's remove the visual of this arrow, but you'll think of focusing on da and just letting d drop out of your mouth. One other way I think of this sometimes is if you're about to say the word da, that you can hop over the sound d in order to say da. And while you're doing that, the sound d just happens. Da-da, da-da, da-da. Let's continue with this pattern, sticking with nonsense sounds for now, but let's change the nonsense sounds using different consonants or vowels. Dema, depay, decide, desire. Let's change this unstressed syllable to a very short r sound with the consonant r. Reside, remi, revi. Okay, good. We've just been doing sounds, getting down to the most fundamental part of language, sounds isolated from words and meaning, getting away from words that we might be used to saying in a specific patterned way. Let's go to the next level now. Let's say our nonsense sounds and continue to reinforce this relationship, the ratio between unstressed and stressed syllables, keeping the unstressed syllables short and on a lower pitch. And let's try to keep that pattern, that ratio, the same as we add a sound or two to make the nonsense syllables into words. Revive, revive, revive. Decide, decide, decide. Depend, depend, depend. Please take a moment to read this next slide and think about this. This is an important concept to really incorporate into your body. Now, we all learned our first language as a spoken language first, and then we learned letters and words to represent the things that we already knew as spoken words. But many of us learned second languages either as written languages first, or we learned them as written and spoken languages at the same time. See if you can get used to visualizing this shape when you see words that fit into this pattern, pattern 2A. More than 70% of our two-syllable verbs will fit into this pattern. So let's use a few verbs as examples. Let's see the written word now, and then see how we might visualize it to remind ourselves of the proper ratio between stressed and unstressed syllables. Confuse, connect, decide, Okay, excellent work at looking at this pattern, pattern 2A. Let's incorporate everything we've just learned now as we go into the drilling. See you there. Pattern 2A. Above. Accept. Achieve. Admit. Adore. Advise. Afford. Again. Ago. Allow. Alone. Approve. Around. Attract. Avoid. Award. Away. Behave. Complain. Complete. Compute. Concern. Confirm. Confuse. Convince. Debate. Decide. Decrease. Depart. Depend. Derive. Design. Dismiss. Divide. Employ. Endure. Enforce. Engrave. Exchange. Explore. Extend. Forget. Forgive. Guitar. Hotel. Import. Improve. Increase. Inform. Install. Instruct. Invest. Involve. Observe. Obtain. Perform. Predict. Present. Prevent. Produce. Project. Promote. Protect. Provide. React. Receive. Record. Recruit. Reduce. Refund. Refuse. Reject. Relate. Release. Relieve. Remark. Remind. remove, renew, repair, replace, reply, report, reserve, reside, resign, respond, restore, restrict, retrieve, return, reverse, review, secure, succeed, suggest, surprise, survey, survive, yourself. Welcome. Okay, we just spent some time breaking down pattern 2A and drilling many words that use this pattern. Here's the next pattern we're going to look at, pattern 2B. And as you can see by looking at them side by side, pattern 2B is also made up of two syllables, but in this case, the stress is on the first syllable. So, this is pattern 2B, and this is the pattern that we'll be exploring in this lecture. Now we'll again use the nonsense sounds da, d. We'll keep the vowel peak written in on the stressed syllable as a reminder that that's the syllable we want to stress and keep our focus on. Now it might be tempting to think that maybe we could just skip the rest of this lecture because the pattern is exactly the same as the last one with the syllables reversed. But I think it's important and extremely useful to still break down step by step how to think about this pattern to make sure that we're very comfortable with it before moving on to the drilling. These two patterns, pattern 2A and pattern 2B, are the fundamental patterns in this course. We need to be extremely comfortable with them in order to build the other patterns. For a moment, let's look at the single stressed syllable again, and let's practice saying single syllables with a vowel peak with a couple of different nonsense sounds. Listen and repeat. Da, ma, lay. Let's now add our unstressed syllable after the stressed syllable, and we'll use the nonsense sounds that we're most familiar with. Try saying that. See if you can use everything that you know from having just drilled da, and from that, see if you can say this pattern. Go ahead and try to say it again now. Now listen and repeat as I say it. Dad. Let's do that 2 more times. Listen and repeat. Dad. Dad. What can you say about the unstressed syllable? Or what would you say to someone if you had to explain to them how to make that unstressed syllable? What do you remember from the last pattern that we drilled? How is this unstressed syllable the same or different than the unstressed syllable in that pattern? Dad. Let's go through some of the points. It's lower in pitch, yes. It's the same as in pattern 2A. The unstressed syllable is lower in pitch than the stressed syllable. What else? Dad. It's shorter in length, right? You can hear that. Dad. Once again, this is the same behavior we saw in pattern 2A. And As with pattern 2A, these last 2 points are true as well. There is less breath and less mental energy used to make the unstressed syllable. So we can look at this and we can all immediately say, okay, great, that makes sense. We understand, we got it. But as you know, our goal here is not to understand with our minds, but to understand with our bodies. And with the unstressed syllable coming after the stressed syllable, we need to take a slightly different approach. So here's our word, whatever the word is, that uses pattern 2B. And we want to once again focus on the stressed syllable, da. With the last pattern, we could think of hopping over the d sound and just letting the d drop out of our mouth before we say da. Here, we want to think of da and then continue thinking of da even while the sound d comes out of our mouth with a minimal amount of breath. If you keep your focus on da, you should find that you use very little breath when you say the unstressed d. Da, d. It can also help to find this pattern in your body if you take the opposite approach. In other words, if you make sure not to allow very much air to escape when you say d, that may help your mind stay focused on the stressed syllable da. Dad. 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 Here's another way you can think of saying this pattern and staying focused on da and not putting too much thought or breath into the unstressed syllable. And that is to stay focused on da and imagine that you're just saying d while you see it in your peripheral vision. So let's make sure we're clear what peripheral vision is. You can skip over this if you know exactly what I'm talking about, but otherwise, find an object in the room and just focus on it for a second. The object is in the center of your field of vision. It's in focus. And you can observe details in that area, but you can also see things that are out on the edge of your vision, out on the periphery. You're not looking right at them, but you can still see them. So right now, my peripheral vision is all right along here. Imagine for a second that the unstressed d is in your peripheral vision. Stay focused on da and continue to focus on da even while you say the sound d, seeing it in your peripheral vision. Now, if this seems too abstract or hard to grasp, don't worry about it. But to make these kinds of subtle adjustments to our speech, the details are very important. So do your best for now, and you can always come back to this again. Focus on da, see d in your peripheral vision, and know that you can say it without focusing on it. Dad. 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 How does that feel? Does it feel easier? It might take some getting used to, but you'll probably find that you're using less breath and less effort when you're saying the unstressed syllable without focusing on it. Okay. Now that we understand ways that you can approach getting this pattern into our body, let's go through a couple of examples of the pattern with different nonsense syllables. Dad. Rod. Laid. Bod. Bon. Bomb. Beam. Bead. seed. Let's now say our nonsense sounds so that we continue to reinforce this relationship between the unstressed and stressed syllables, keeping the unstressed syllables short and on a lower pitch. And let's try to keep that pattern the same as we add a sound or two to make the nonsense syllables into words. Here we go. Calm. Common. Common. Reason. 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 Nation. 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 Now, as I bring up this next slide, think about this for written words that are spoken with pattern 2B. As we have seen, written words look different than they sound. Pattern 2B is especially common for two-syllable nouns. More than 90% of two-syllable nouns will stress the first syllable. Let's look at a few examples of the written word now, and then see how we might visualize them to remind ourselves of the proper ratio between stressed and unstressed syllables. Travel. Promise. Practice. Good work. You've just covered patterns 2A and 2B. These patterns are the fundamental patterns of the course. If you find it's a little tricky to get used to them, don't worry about it. You can still move forward and you can come back and review these. If you really feel like you want to review them now, or if you feel like there was a lot there and you didn't get it all in, and you're excited to go back and review it, you can absolutely do so. But don't feel overwhelmed. If some of the descriptions seem too abstract, or if there's one that's too much, let that go and just find one that you can hook onto. Don't try to make every image work for you. Okay? See you in the next lesson. Okay, here we go with pattern 2B. Able. Action. Anchor. Angle. Answer. Apple. Average. Balance. Beauty. Better. Bitter. Body. Bubble. Butter. Cable. Cancel. Certain. Children. Cooking. Cover. Credit. Distant. Dozen. Equal. even, fable, fashion, father, favor, flavor, fossil, fraction, fragile, gather, happen, hopeful, hurry, injure, inner, island, jacket, joyful, kindest, laser, later, lecture, lengthen, letter, level, lower, manage, marble, measure, mention, mountain, nation, neater, offer, often, only, order, other, outer, owner, paper, pattern, person, picture, practice, promise, purchase, question, razor, reason, render, rescue, research, runner, scatter, sentence, separate, shaken, shorten, speaker, spinach, spoken, station, stolen, structure, table, tenant, thousand, ticket, travel, uncle, vary, water, waiver, woken, worry, let's review the two-syllable intonation patterns that we've studied and drilled. Pattern 2A and pattern 2B. As I mentioned, these are the main focus of the two-syllable intonation patterns. These two patterns are really the fundamental patterns of the course. There is, however, one other pattern we want to take a look at, and that is this pattern, pattern 2C. This pattern is less common and less important for us really to spend time on, but we do want to touch on it. It should be very easy compared to the work that you did on the last two patterns. Notice that there's no smaller or unstressed syllable in this pattern. So all the great work you just did in practicing the unstressed syllable and getting comfortable with it, getting it in your body, you just want to let that go for a moment now as we drill this sound. In many ways, this pattern is just like saying two one-syllable words, one after another. We'll focus on words that do stress the first syllable. Notice the first syllable is written higher in pitch, but the second syllable is not shorter in length. One of the challenges in speaking English as a second language is in getting comfortable with the shortness of the unstressed syllable. This pattern, da-da, can actually serve as a reminder of what we don't want patterns 2A or 2B to sound like. Now, we won't spend a lot of time on this pattern because our goal in this course, one of the primary goals, is to make sure we're not overstressing unstressed syllables. So it's important to know that da-da exists, but we don't need to spend extra time drilling it. Let's talk a little bit about this pattern. Think of this pattern as an exception. And as I talked about a minute ago, this is a good example of what overpronunciation of an unstressed syllable would look like. And finally, this is a common pattern for compound words. And there are many compound words, so it's important that we know this. And that's what we're going to focus on now. So the question is, what are compound words? And I will tell you, you may already know, you may have some idea. Compound words are two words, two nouns or an adjective and a noun, that come together to form a new word. Sometimes the new word is still written as two separate words. Sometimes they're combined to a single word, and sometimes they're hyphenated. Let's look at a few examples. The words base and ball combine to create the compound word baseball. And this is what the intonation of that word looks like. Baseball. The words note and book combine to create the compound word notebook. And this is what the intonation of that word looks like. Notebook. The word some and times combine to create the compound word sometimes. And this is what that intonation pattern looks like. Sometimes. Let's just take a moment to get this into our body with nonsense syllables. And don't work too hard. This is probably very simple. Da-da. Okay, using our familiar nonsense syllables. Let's also change to other nonsense syllables. Listen and repeat. Dima. Sise. Koba. And let's just do a few nonsense syllables, merging them into words. Daytime. Daytime. And of course, that is the word daytime. Libo. Lifebow. Lifeboat. Sobaw. Snowball. Snowball. Very good. Let's now drill a few words with this pattern. See you in the next lecture. Okay, this is the drill of pattern 2C. Here we go. Aircraft. Background. Baseball. Bathroom. Birthday. Bookshelf. Brainstorm. Briefcase. Carpool. Countdown. Cowboy. Daydream. Driftwood. Driveway. Eyeball. Flashback. Goldfish. Greenhouse. Keyhole. Landslide. Mailbox. Moonlight. Notebook. Oatmeal. Output. Pancake. Password. Popcorn. Raincoat. Seashore. Skateboard. Somewhere. Teardrop. Toolbox. Weekend. Let's add to our strong foundation, now that we have the two basic building blocks, pattern 2A and 2B. We'll now look at three-syllable patterns and different words that fit into the three different stress patterns. If you've worked through the course methodically and you feel comfortable with the two-syllable patterns, you'll probably feel comfortable moving into this first three-syllable pattern pretty easily. We can really think of this pattern da-da-da as being a combination of da-da, highlighted here in red, and da-da. Now that sounds pretty straightforward intellectually, but let's make sure we get it into our body. Again, if you're comfortable with da-da and da-da, pattern 2A and pattern 2B, this will feel quite natural. But let's take a step-by-step approach to get comfortable with this pattern. These are the names of the patterns 2A and 2B for your reference. Now let's take that away. And let's start with the pattern 2A, da-da, in order to get comfortable with this three-syllable pattern. Now we'll be bringing pattern 2B back in a moment. Da-da, 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 da-da-da. Of course, we can write in our syllables or our nonsense sounds inside of the boxes. And we can add the vowel peak symbol to remind us to focus on the stressed syllable and to give it proper length and a vowel peak. And let's drill this a few more times. And we'll use different nonsense syllables. And let's just continue to drill this in 3 steps. Each time we'll drill the core of the word, But at first, we'll say the first and second syllable, and then we'll say the second and third syllable, and then we'll say all three syllables. First and second, the second and third, and then all three syllables. Continuing to keep the stressed syllable da in the center of our focus and letting the unstressed syllables d and d just happen, just fall out of our mouth with very little breath and without any of our mental energy. And we'll keep this vowel peak symbol in place to encourage us to focus on the stressed syllable, lengthening it and going up and down in pitch to create a vowel peak. And let's change the nonsense sounds that we used in the syllables before. I'm going to keep the three boxes that represent the three syllables in place throughout, but just focus on the letters that appear. If a box is empty, don't say anything for that sound. Okay? Here we go. To be, bida, debida, ramai, maida, ramaida, connect, nection, connection, connection. Now this is interesting, this word connection, and it's interesting to think of the part of speech for this word. It's a noun that's created from the verb connect, and the verb connect is using the intonation pattern 2A that we know well. I want to look at pattern 3A, this pattern now, in another way, and to do that, I'm going to bring up this pattern. Now it's true that sometimes we're intentionally working slowly to get these patterns into our body. Early on, we discussed the importance of muscle memory. I don't want to work too quickly, but at the same time, I don't want to work too slowly. So to illustrate this next idea, let's take this two-syllable pattern, and we could start slowly with nonsense syllables, but I think we can actually go right into a word. Nation. Now, as you know, we want to be able to say this word primarily thinking of the stressed syllable and letting the unstressed syllable just happen without much thought, energy, or breath. Nation. Now, let's think of saying something else in place of that stressed syllable. We could say a different syllable, such as the sound ak, and create the word action. But instead, let's replace nay with a two-syllable verb. This is the verb connect. And if we move connect over and we replace nay with it, we get connection. This is an extremely useful way to think of this three-syllable pattern. There are probably many words you already know and are already saying that are made from two-syllable words. Now please take a moment to read this next slide to yourself. Okay? Many two-syllable verbs with the more common stress pattern can add an unstressed syllable to create a new word. Now let's look at a few examples of this before moving into the drilling of this pattern. Here's our common verb form, where we will list some verbs. And here we'll list some three-syllable words that are made from these verbs. Listen and repeat. Connect, connector, connection, connecting, arrive, arrival, arriving, remind, reminder, reminding, confuse, confusion, confusing, allow, allowance, allowing, depend, dependent, depending, contain, container, containment, containing. Good work on completing your first three-syllable pattern. Let's go into the drills. Here is our first three-syllable pattern, pattern 3A. According, addition, admission, allowance, appearance, arisen, attention, attribute, awoken, banana, beginning, commercial, commission, completely, complexion, compliance, compounding, computer, condition, confusion, connection, consider, container, contribute, correction, deciding, decision, deliver, demanding, department, dependent, deposit, description, determine, develop, direction, directly, discussion, distribute, divided, dividing, division, effective, employer, employment, encounter, encourage, equation, equipment, establish, example, excitement, expensive, expression, financial, forbidden, forgiven, forgotten, foundation, imagine, importance, imposter, including, inflation, initial, insurance, internal, invented, invention, investment, involvement, location, maneuver, mistaken, objective, omission, opinion, percentage, perception, perfection, perplexing, position, potential, prohibit, recover, recycle, refurbish, related, relaxing, remember, reminder, retainer, selecting, selective, selection, specific, successful, together, united, vanilla, okay, here is our next pattern, pattern 3B. And of course, the first syllable is stressed, followed by two unstressed syllables. Okay, this is simple in concept. We're just adding another unstressed syllable to pattern 2B. Here's pattern 2B. Add another unstressed syllable, and we get this pattern. Pattern 3B, right? Simple in concept, but we want to take some steps to get this understanding into our body. Now, if we just think add another syllable here, we might end up using too much breath on it. So let's discuss some approaches we can take to get very comfortable with this pattern. One approach that is extremely useful is to make sure we're thinking of and focusing on the stressed syllable. We want to keep our mental energy focused on the stressed syllable and keep thinking of the stressed syllable even while these two unstressed syllables fall out of our mouth. Again, this is something that's fairly straightforward in concept, but how do we actually do it? Let's build on our foundation. Yeah, let's build on our foundation. Let's build on all the good work you did earlier in the course when we were looking at two-syllable patterns. Let's bring up pattern 2B again. We're going to build on the good work that you did earlier in the course when we were looking at the two-syllable pattern, pattern 2B. And just as a reminder, let's add an arrow which indicates our focus, the place where we're putting our mental energy. And let's put this unstressed syllable in parentheses to indicate that we want to try to not focus on that, but instead remain focused on the stressed syllable, da, dad, dad, dad. Try that a couple of times and see what that feels like in your body. Let that feeling register in your body. You can pause for a moment to do this if you need to. Then, once you're ready, we're going to move into the three-syllable pattern and see if you can say it with the same feeling that you had when you said the two-syllable pattern. See if you can stay focused on da while you say da, da, da. Da, da, da. Da, da, da. Da, da, da. We're going to drill these back and forth. If you need to, pause for a second and see if you can find the feeling in your body. Da, da, da. Here we go. Back and forth between da, da, and da, da, da. Reinforcing that you're doing the same thing each time, whether you say one or two unstressed syllables. It's the same thing each time. You're thinking da, and it's either d or d. Dad, 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 dad. Remember that for the unstressed sound d, we're not using any vowel sound. The tongue comes up and touches the gum ridge a tiny bit, letting a tiny bit of air escape between the gum ridge and the tip of the tongue, creating the sound d. If you're making the sound d 2 times in a row, your tongue does not have to move all the way down from the gum ridge. You can really think of keeping the tongue almost in place and sending the air through for the sound d, and let the tip of the tongue move right back into position for the second d. D. You can also practice the sound d by itself. Just like the single unstressed sound d, you want to be able to make this pair of sounds with very little of our air supply. Let's try this. D. 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 See if you can do that using a very small amount of air. D. 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 Now, of course, depending on the word you're saying, there are many different places your tongue might need to be. It might need to move somewhere for the unstressed syllable. However, the tip of the tongue to the gum ridge is one of the more common places for consonant sounds to be made. But in the exercise, our goal is to get comfortable with the ratio between the stressed and the unstressed syllables. Let's do this a few more times. D. 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 As you do this, can you imagine that you just said a stressed syllable immediately beforehand, where the syllable da was written a moment ago? Can you keep thinking that imaginary da while you say d? Now, when we get to the next pattern, we'll be making this same did sound, but it will be before the stressed syllable. Think about the feeling in your body as you just say did while imagining a stressed syllable before it. Can you also, just for a moment, while the feeling is fresh in your body, imagine that the stressed syllable is coming after the sound did. Everything else about the sound should be the same. Just imagine the stressed syllable is coming afterwards. Okay, let's try it 3 times. Did it. Did it. Did it. Great. You have a head start on the next pattern. Let's just stick with this pattern 3A and take one more approach to get very comfortable. It's good to have a few different approaches, especially when we're trying to override old speaking patterns where we might be overpronouncing unstressed syllables. Let's refer back for a moment to the last 3-syllable pattern we did. One of the ways we got comfortable with a pattern like this was by thinking of it as a combination of the pattern da and the pattern da-de. We have many words that are created from a verb with the common pattern da and an unstressed syllable at the end, such as connect. So to get comfortable with a word like connection, we started with a 2-syllable word that had the same ending, such as nation, and then we took the verb form of connect, and we thought of replacing nay with the sound connect. And we ended up with connection. Well, for this pattern, pattern 3B, we can take a similar approach, but instead of combining da and da-de, this pattern can be thought of in a way as combining da-de and da-de. So let's break this down and take a look at this step by step. Let's start with a 2-syllable word like speaking. And let's introduce another word. We'll use a verb, but instead of the stress of da that we used in the last example to make connect into connection, let's use a verb that stresses the first syllable, like answer. And let's think of replacing the sound speak with the sound answer. Now we know in a moment we're going to be saying a word like speaking, but we're going to replace the sound speak with a single thought, but it will be answer. So let's say each of these words, starting with the second one. Speaking. Answering. 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 So we're saying 3 syllables, but in a way, we're thinking of this as being the 2-syllable pattern that we're comfortable with, da-de, but we're saying another 2-syllable word inside of the sound da. You can think of this visual. Now let's use this diagram for a few more words that follow this form. Balancing. Challenging. Entering. Following. Practicing. Welcoming. Wondering. Okay, good job at looking at different ways of exploring this pattern. Let's move on to the drills. Okay, here we go with pattern 3B. accurate, actually, answering, article, audience, balancing, balcony, bicycle, calendar, characters, chemistry, cinnamon, citizen, company, complement, consonant, constantly, currently, difficult, emptiness, energy, estimate, exercise, government, happening, hospital, industry, innocent, instrument, juggling, limited, lovable, magical, management, marketing, melody, memories, minimum, monitor, musical, national, numerous, opening, period, personal, physical, positive, president, probably, properly, recipe, rectify, register, stadium, strategy, syllable, technical, temperature, tropical, various. Let's look at our final three-syllable pattern, which is pattern 3C. We want to get this pattern in our body as relaxed and natural as our two-syllable patterns. And the simplest way of looking at this pattern is by going back to our first two-syllable pattern, which is pattern 2A, da, and saying an additional unstressed syllable before that pattern. Pretty straightforward. Let's start getting this into our body. Okay? We're going to look at this from a few different ways of doing it. You can certainly try them all. I think they all have value. I think they're all useful ways of drilling and mastering the intonation pattern. But if you have one that you like the most, don't feel like you need to practice all of them. If there's one that's difficult for you, it might be worth sticking with it and trying to get it, but it's also fine to just throw it out. If that particular image isn't working for you, just throw it out and stick with the others. For starters, let's use the idea of hopping over the unstressed sounds by focusing on the stressed syllable. We did this for the two-syllable pattern 2A. Let's look at that pattern written here with the vowel peak and the nonsense syllables d and da. The way we practiced this was by focusing on the stressed syllable da and mentally hopping over the unstressed sound d, not really thinking about it. We thought of the sound d just dropping out of our mouth as we stayed focused on the sound da. We also paid attention a little bit to our breath, knowing that the unstressed syllable will require less of our thought and less of our breath. So we want to think da and say da. Of course, for pattern 3C, we're going to do the same thing, but instead of just hopping over one unstressed syllable, d, we're going to hop over two of them. Now let's try this. To reinforce the idea of thinking da, in the beginning, I'll usually just say da, and then I'll say the pattern once. So let's do that now. Please listen and repeat as I first say da, and then the pattern. Da, da-da-da. So even though we just said two different things, the idea is that both times we're just thinking da. Let's try that one more time. Listen and repeat. Da, da-da-da. Remember also that we drilled these two unstressed syllables together with the last pattern. That was part of a different pattern in which the unstressed syllables both followed the stressed syllable. It might be tempting to want to skip over this section, assuming that if our body can do it for that pattern, it should be even easier for this pattern. But we still want to drill this in steps to fully understand it, not just with our minds, but with our body as well. So let's drill this pattern a few times now with different nonsense sounds. The idea here is we're going to keep our mental energy focused on the stressed syllable as we say all three syllables. Here we go. Da-da-da. Da-da-ba. Da-da-ma. Da-da-me. Da-da-say. Okay, good. If that works for you, you might not need to go any further in exploring this pattern, but I'm going to look at it a few other ways as well. Here's method number 2. I described our two-syllable patterns, da-da and da-da, as being the fundamental patterns, the foundation of the course. When we're comfortable with them, it becomes easy to get comfortable with adding syllables. So let's look at those patterns for a moment, and we're going to look at them next to each other, starting with da-da, followed by da-da. Let's say these patterns with a slight pause between them. I'll say both patterns, and then you repeat. Da-da, da-da. We're going to do that again. Now watch. Da-da, da-da. Not rushing, but allowing slightly less space between the two patterns. Again, listen as I say both patterns, and then repeat. Da-da, da-da. Now let's stick with this. Continue to watch the images and listen and repeat what I say. Da, 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 da. All we're doing next is saying the same thing we just said, but leaving a little space after the first sound da. Listen and repeat. And take a look at the diagram. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, da, da. Da, da, da. Da, da, da. Let's write in the letters for the sounds we just made. And now, let's keep this pattern and we'll use the same sounds for the unstressed syllables and we'll change the stressed syllable. Listen and repeat. Didama. Didaba. Didaga. Didapa. Another useful way to approach this pattern is by alternating it with pattern 2A. Here's our diagram representing pattern 3C, but let's just focus on the second and third syllables. We'll keep the blue boxes there for the first syllable, but we're not going to say anything at first. At first, we'll just say da, and then we'll write in a sound for the first syllable, and we'll say that pattern. Da. Now the purpose of this drill is to see how similar the 3-syllable pattern is to the 2-syllable pattern that you already know. As you repeat the two patterns back and forth, you should feel a similar effortlessness. It should take about the same amount of energy to say the patterns with or without the first unstressed syllable. Da. Da. Let's continue with this exercise, but we'll use different nonsense syllables, which will help us feel more comfortable when we use this intonation pattern for words. For now, we'll keep using the d sound for the unstressed syllable, and we'll change the stressed syllable. Listen and repeat. Daba. Didaba. Debe. Didabe. Deme. Didame. Let's just drill a few more times, but now we'll change the sound of some of the unstressed syllables as well. Listen carefully and repeat. Gami. Digami. Deme. Goodame. Now let's do this with a couple of actual words, but we'll start by doing nonsense syllables again, with da-da, da-da, da-da-da, allow, disallow. We're going to do the same thing, starting with nonsense syllables again. Da-da, da-da-da, appear, disappear, da-da, da-da-da, commend, recommend. Here's our fourth and final method for looking at this intonation pattern. It's sort of a variation on the last method, but it's different enough that it's definitely worth taking a look at. Again, we're going to alternate pattern 3C with a similar pattern, but this time we'll use the first unstressed syllable and not the second one. Once again, we'll show the boxes for pattern 3C, but at first, we're going to do something like pattern 2A, but we're actually using the first unstressed syllable. Now I'm putting this arrow here to suggest that you keep this D sound connected in your mind to the stressed da sound. Don't think of allowing space for the second D to come in. You don't need space. And you don't need breath, and you don't need thought. We'll get to that syllable in a second, but for now, let's say this. It's probably going to sound exactly like pattern 2A. Listen and repeat. Da-da. And we're going to include this syllable as well, but we're putting it in parentheses. You want to think the same thing you thought when you just said da-da last time, only this time you'll let a second d fall out of your mouth right after you say the first one. Okay? Listen and repeat. Da-da-da. Okay, let's drill a few nonsense syllables, and then we'll even drill one word using this method. Pay attention to the nonsense syllables sounds. We're going to do something a little different. Listen and repeat. Da-da. Da-da-da. Ba-ba. Ba-da-ba. Ga-ga. Ga-da-ga. Sa-sa. Si-da-sa. Induce. Introduce. Good work. See if you can let go of everything that we just did here as we move into the drilling. And see if you can find that the technique is already in your body. Let everything go and just focus on the drilling. Okay, this is pattern 3C. Acquiesce. Ascertain. Disallow. Disappear. Disappoint. Disapprove. Disarray. Disconnect. Disinfect. Disobey. Engineer. Entertain. Guarantee. Insecure. Interact. Intercept. Interrupt. Introduce. Introduced. Magazine. Overdrawn. Overwhelm. Preconceive. Rearrange. Recollect. Recommend. Reenact. Referee. Reinforce. Reminisce. Represent. Serenade. tambourine, understand, volunteer, with the extensive drilling you've done in the course of pitch tones and the foundational patterns 2A and 2B, you should find that you're comfortable saying most multisyllabic words. This does not mean that every word in your speaking vocabulary that you may have a reflex of overpronouncing will automatically adjust itself. In some cases, you might need to look at a word and break it down into pieces and, in a sense, relearn it. But as you'll see, as we move into these 4-syllable patterns, you'll probably be able to say the patterns with the proper focus on the stressed syllable and proper reduction of the unstressed syllables. With a strong foundation, we don't need to spend more time looking at different ways to approach the pronunciation of multisyllabic words. We can actually spend less time on them. This is our first 4-syllable pattern. Pattern 4A. And the easiest way to think of a multisyllabic word is to look at the core, the stressed syllable, and obviously this is the syllable we're going to stress, right? We can put a vowel peak over it, and we can give it a name like da, and it's easy to see two clear patterns that contain da. We have the pattern da, and at the same time, we have the pattern da-da-da. And we can really think of this pattern as being these two patterns, pattern 2A and pattern 3B, happening at the same time. And creating pattern 4A. So let's just drill a few times with nonsense syllables and a few times with words to make sure we're comfortable with the pattern. As we did before, we'll keep all of the boxes that represent the pattern in place, but just focus on the boxes that have letters written in them as the different patterns appear. First da-da, and then da-da-da. With your primary focus, of course, always being on the stressed syllable da. Listen and repeat. Da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da-da. If this feels right, let's keep going. Everything we've talked about previously still applies. Our focus, our mental energy should be on the stressed syllable. We can help by using a vowel peak to go up and down. We can check in and remind ourselves to use less breath and less energy on the unstressed syllables. You can stop and do that occasionally if you feel you need to, but otherwise, if what you're doing feels right, trust it and just keep moving forward. Listen and repeat. Da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da-da. Certificate, certificate, companionship, companionship, identical, identical. Okay, let's move into the drilling. Okay, here is the drill for pattern 4A. Accomplishment, accumulate, activity, additional, appropriate, certificate, collaborate, community, companionship, cooperate, development, emergency, experiment, harmonica, humanity, identical, impractical, improbable, industrial, inhabited, intensify, investigate, machinery, material, participate, particular, political, significant, society, technology, this is our second four-syllable pattern, pattern 4B. As we discussed in the last lecture, the easiest way to think of a multisyllabic word is to look at the core of it, the stressed syllable. Obviously, this is the syllable that we're going to stress, right? We can put a vowel peak over it, and we can give it a name like da. And it's easy to see that there are two clear patterns that contain da. The first pattern is da-da-da. And the second pattern is da-d. And we can really think of this pattern as being these two patterns, pattern 3C and pattern 2B, happening at the same time. So we can see these come together and create pattern 4B. So let's drill a few times with some nonsense syllables and a couple of times with words to make sure we're comfortable with this pattern. As we did before, we'll keep all of the boxes in place, but just say syllables where letters are written in. Okay, here we go. Da-da-da, da-da, da-da-da-da, ma-ma-ma, mama, ma-ma-mama, fa-fa-fa, fa-fa, fa-fa-fa-fa, intone, nation, intonation, celebrate, bration, celebration. Good work. Let's move into the word drilling. Okay, let's take a look at pattern 4B. academic, accidental, activation, celebration, consequently, definition, democratic, economic, education, entertainment, exploration, fundamental, independence, information, intonation, ornamental, preposition, relaxation, situation, understanding, this is our third four-syllable pattern, pattern 4C. To approach this pattern, I'd like to go back to one of our fundamental patterns, which, after the amount of drilling you've done, is probably very comfortably in your body. I'm talking about pattern 2B. You've drilled this pattern enough that you're probably saying the unstressed syllable with the proper amount of effortlessness. In other words, to say da or to say dad probably doesn't feel very different to you. And that's exactly what you want. You want dad to feel just as easy and natural as if you're saying da. Let's alternate this pattern a few times as a reminder, and then we'll get right back to pattern 4C. But first, let's put up this green box to represent the sound or word that we're going to say. Now, we've used boxes before in this course to represent syllables, but now we're using a different box, this green box, and this box represents an idea or a word or a nonsense sound, and we don't really care if it's one syllable or two. Now, we're going to alternate our patterns, and we'll keep them inside of this green box. So there may be one syllable or there may be two syllables. The important thing is that each one of them is a single thing, a single idea. Now, let's do this together. Listen and repeat. Da, dad, da, dad, da, dad. Okay, good. Now, let's take our green box and we'll put it over this pattern, replacing the first two syllables, and we'll still have it followed by the last two unstressed syllables. Again, we'll alternate. Right now, the box is replacing da, but we'll also use the sound da here as we alternate. But notice that what's consistent here is that we have one idea represented by the green box, followed by two unstressed syllables. And inside of the green box, we're just going to put one idea. We're going to do the same thing we did a moment ago and alternate between the two patterns. So it's as if in each case you're thinking box da. And the box may be da or it may be da. But we want them both to feel equally as easy. Okay, here we go. Da da da. Da 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 da. da da da, da 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 da, da da da, da 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 da. Now notice, as I switch to this next slide, da 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 da, that this is exactly the same as the previous sound we made, but they're written differently. But they should sound exactly the same. Now keep that in mind. Let's drill these same nonsense syllables a few more times, followed by a couple of words, and then we'll move on. Listen and repeat. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Generously. 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 Ultimately. 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 Okay, very good work. Let's move on to the drills. This is pattern 4C. Adequately. Agriculture. Arbitrary. Centimeter. Championship. Consequences. Criticism. Enterprises. Exercises. Generously. Literary. Mandatory. Minimally. Necessary. Nominally. Ordinary. Passionately. Permanently. Practicable. Supermarket. Television. Temporary. Territory. Ultimately. Voluntary. After exploring so many different approaches for patterns up to 4 syllables, we don't need any further explanation for the 5-syllable word patterns. Focus on the stressed syllable of the word and allow the other syllables to be properly reduced. If you find a word in the drills challenging, you can always pause and use any of the techniques you've learned to make sure you are properly stressing and reducing the appropriate syllables. Most words that we use in everyday speech are 3 syllables or less. Getting comfortable with 4 and 5 syllable words will make all of your speech sound and feel more relaxed and natural. This is pattern 5A. Abbreviated. Accommodating. Administrator. Anticipated. Considerable. Extenuating. Imaginary. Immediately. Refrigerator. Vocabulary. This is pattern 5B. Agricultural. Anniversary. Elementary. Generosity. Independently. Indestructible. Individual. International. Personality. Representative. Serendipity. Simultaneously. Temporarily. Trigonometry. Unidentified. This is pattern 5C. Characteristic. Civilization. Clarification. Diagnostician. Gentrification. Notification. Organization. Pediatrician. Representation. Simplification. Pattern 5D. Ambulatory. Capitalism. Celebratory. circulatory, nationalism, patriotism, regionalism, regulatory, respiratory, sectionalism, Congratulations on having completed the intonation course. Continue to revisit this course and drill the different patterns until they become part of your speech, and you find yourself using them in a completely natural way. We've done a lot of work to make sure the unstressed syllables of words are sufficiently short. You may find this is a bit of an adjustment in your speech. It's possible that if in the past you were pronouncing those syllables with more length, that you adopted a quicker rate of speech to compensate for the greater syllable length. You may find that since you are now reducing the length of the syllables, that your speech is quicker. Remember that while it's valuable to be able to speak quickly, that is not our only or ultimate goal. Our goal is for our speech to reflect our thoughts. As you use what you've learned, think about just staying relaxed and making sure that your breath is flowing easily. While our speech may sometimes be quick, it should not sound rushed. In many ways, the work and drills that we've done is the equivalent of rehearsal time for an actor. When it's time for an actor to get on stage or in front of the camera, he or she wants to forget about all of the rehearsal and just be. Ideally, it's the same with your life at work or outside of work, on the stage of life. Trust that the work you have done in these rehearsal sessions has gotten into your speech. And don't try to micromanage everything you say when you're talking with others. Just be in the moment and enjoy the conversation. My hope is that sometime in the future you'll find yourself speaking to someone, freely expressing your thoughts, and you'll just happen to notice how easily your speech is flowing. And when that happens, be sure to thank yourself for all the hard work you put in to get to that point. Congratulations again, and thank you for taking this course. I wish you all the best in your endeavors.